Hello and welcome to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg, and I am here today to do a book haul revisit for the month of January. For the uninitiated, this is where I look back at past book hauls. And because we're in January, I'm going to look back to January book hauls that I have done in the past 5 years of book hauls. In fact, I got this idea from Doris at Aldi Books. I will link her channel down below. She went through a period where she was looking back at previous book hauls to see how many of the books she had read and make decisions about whether or not she wanted to keep them. That was sort of the intention. And what I do is see how many books I've read, how many I would still like to read, how many I have unhauled, and start the process of thinking about books that I might unhaul in the future. And my measurement criteria for this are books that I have read, books that I have unhauled, and my main watch out criteria is books that I unhauled without reading, because that to me is where I need to do a little bit better in spending money on books. The purpose of this is to make myself a more intentional book purchaser and be a little bit more responsible with how I spend money on books. Obviously, I have a lot of them. And someone suggested after my last book haul revisit, which will be linked down below, that I should also keep tabs on how many books I spent money on, but then subsequently listened to on audio. Because if the purpose is to hold myself accountable for spending money on books, that should be a criteria. Now, I am going to start doing that. I am going to start counting how many of the books I ended up listening to on audio. What's interesting about that is I don't actually care if I ended up listening to a book on audio. You know, everybody approaches the process of building a library differently. And for me, I just want to have a well-curated library. I want to have a mix of books that I want to read and sort of aspirational reading, a collection of library builders, like things that I would like to get to someday, maybe not in the immediate future, but someday. And a collection of books that I read and really liked. And therefore, if I purchased a book and I have it in my library and I ended up listening to it on audio and I still like it enough to keep it in my library, that's fine. The way I listen to audiobooks is really, I used to have 3 avenues that I would approach. Now I'm down to 2. I canceled my subscription to Scribd and Everand. Good riddance. And now I have Libby, which is a library app. I don't spend money to use that app. So any audiobook that I listen to on Libby is for free. I do have a subscription to Libro, and that is a subscription service. So technically, I am spending money on a subscription service, but the way I think about it, I'm not spending extra money to get an audio version. Like, I'm not essentially buying 2 versions of a book in order to listen to the audio. So I don't know. I just don't mind if I end up listening to a book on audio, but it is something that I will be watching for in the future. Now, I am also looking at ways of keeping these videos on the short side, because starting in March, we're going to be going through 6 years of book hauls, because March is the year that I did my first book haul. So it's not with the beginning of the calendar year. So I just need to find ways to streamline these. So in the interest of timing, I have removed any books that were purchased for my Pulitzer Prize project. I'm trying to read all of the books that have won a Pulitzer Prize for fiction. And at some point along the way, I decided I wanted to own a copy of all of those books. So books that I've purchased for that project were purchased for a very specific reason. It's not, to me, the same as spending money on a book with the intention of reading it. Sometimes it feels different from that. It was for a project. I have also removed books that were gifted to me or sent to me by a publisher. I've removed what I'm calling library builders, but in cases where I wanted to get all of the books by a specific author, I did it with Sue Grafton. They're all right there. I did it with Louise Erdrich. You can't see it. She's low on one of those shelves. And I've kind of done it with Toni Morrison. I feel like I should kind of start counting her for that as well. I have also removed books that I had already read and purchased to have a copy in my library. So, and I think that last part, books that I purchased to have a copy in my library, goes to why I don't actually care if I listen to something on audio, because to me, it's just about having a well-curated library. So if I've listened to something on audio and I end up purchasing a copy to bring into my library, I don't count it for this, but it's just, for me, it's more about having that well-curated library, if that makes sense. I'm only including books that I purchased for myself with the intention or hope of reading that book sometime soon, if that makes sense. So let's get going, because we spent about 5.5 minutes talking about process, and that's not what you're here to do. I do have plans for maybe to shrink this list a little more. I'm just thinking about things. So let's just jump into the actual book haul revisit. And we're going to start with the most recent and work our way back in time. So January of 2024 is where we begin. And there are 4 books that I brought into my library last January that meet our criteria for this book haul revisit. The first is Year of Wonders by Geraldine Brooks. This is kind of Pulitzer Project adjacent, because Geraldine Brooks won a Pulitzer Prize for her book March. And I have read that book. I need to reread it at some point for my Pulitzer Project. And Year of Wonders is a book that I consistently hear very good things about. So I would probably like to read this and then do my reread of March. Have not gotten around to it yet, but that's totally fine. I don't really mind. So this is Pulitzer adjacent. Haven't read it. We'll get to it at some point. It's not going to go anywhere in the meantime. So we start off with a not so successful story. The next 3 are actually all from the same author. Barbara Pym is an author who has been consistently recommended to me. And in January of 2024, I went into my local used bookstore and these 3 books had popped up. There's Quartet in Autumn, Excellent Women, and Crampton Hodnet. Of the 3, I have only read one, Crampton Hodnet. It actually ended up being the first book that I read in all of 2024, because last year I really struggled getting my reading off the ground, and this ended up being kind of perfect for that. This is a library builder situation. I had thought that I wanted to try one soon, and I did that. Mission accomplished. I kind of thought to myself, well, wouldn't it be fun if I made this a tradition to read a Barbara Pym in January? But I don't want to hold myself to something like that. So I will get to Quartet in Autumn and Excellent Women. I don't really feel bad, especially since these were cheap. Oh, yeah, it still has the price sticker. Excellent Women was $1.75. And the sticker's not on Quartet in Autumn, but I'm willing to bet it was also about $1.75. And that is kind of the watch out criteria, or my thinking on streamlining. Like, spending $1.75 on a book is not the same as spending $20 on a book and then holding yourself accountable for it. So I might think about that as March approaches, and I need a way to streamline these videos further, but we'll see. So these aren't going anywhere. I will hopefully be getting around to reading them, because I did enjoy Crampton Hodnet a good deal. And those are the 4 books that I brought into my library in January of 2024. I have only read one. 1 out of 4 is 25%. Even I can do that math. I have not unhauled any, which means, of course, I have not unhauled any without reading them. And I listened to none of them on audio. I actually read the print book of Crampton Hodnet, so that's also a big 0. And there you go. Let's move to January of 2023. There were only 2 books that qualify for our purposes here. The first is The Deviance War, The Homosexual versus the United States of America by Eric Cervini. I have not read this yet, and this is definitely a book that I would listen to on audio, and that's part of also why I feel like I really don't mind if I end up listening to a book on audio, because I tend to do better with nonfiction on audio. And because of the subject matter of this book, I really just felt like I wanted to have it in my library. It was a Pulitzer Prize finalist. It's a topic that is near and dear to my heart. And this was when Eric Cervini, the author, had started his, I don't remember what it was called before it was called Alstora, but he was doing the big book bus for gay books, and he had a gay bookstore. So it's signed. So I got it to show support for that before it turned to Alstora. Oh, that's a whole other issue. So again, I will probably listen to this on audio when I do get around to reading it, but I feel like that's fine. And the other one I ordered from the same place was We Are Not Broken by George M. Johnson. George M. Johnson wrote the book Not All Boys Aren't Blue, or something like that, which is fantastic. And it's a very frequently banned book. So this was a way of supporting Eric Cervini's bookstore, which is now something it's complicated. But this is also a signed edition of it. And ultimately, I did read this one, but I listened to it on audio. So we start to run into that issue. And again, not a problem for me because George M. Johnson read it, does a good job reading their audiobooks. And again, it was just a case where I wanted to support the book and the new initiative that Eric Cervini had started. And I thought this is subject matter for something that I would want to have in my library. So here it is. But I did listen to it on audio. So of those 2 books, I've read 1. That's 50%. Again, even I can do that math. I have not unhauled any, so that's a 0. I have not unhauled any without reading, so that's also a 0. And I listened to one of them on audio. The only book that I've read was done on audio. So again, even I can do that math, 50%. Let's move back to January of 2022, where we start getting a little bit larger, but we also start running into some unhauls. The first book that I hauled in January of 2022 was The Membranes by Chi-Ta Wei, translated by Ari Larissa Heinrich. In 2022, I was co-hosting the LGBTQ plus in translation read-along or reading project with Jen the librarian, and The Membranes was the first selection. And I did read it, and I found it very interesting, but I ultimately started thinking to myself, I don't know that I liked this enough to hold on to it, so I unhauled it. But I did read it. The next book that I hauled was also related to the LGBTQ plus in translation reading project, To the Friend Who Did Not Save My Life by Hervé Guibert, translated by Linda Coverdale. So the way we did it is you would select 2 or 3 books, and then the people who were participating would vote. The Membranes was the winner of that vote. And then if you wanted to read the other book, you could. And this sounded interesting enough that I wanted to make sure I got a copy. I haven't gotten around to reading it yet. So it's here. It's not really in danger of going anywhere. And at some point, I would like to get around to reading this book as well. But I just have not managed to do it yet. Then we have Still Life by Sarah Winman, which I have not gotten around to reading yet, but would really like to. I finally read my first Sarah Winman book in 2024. It was Tin Man. I read it in June, and it ended up being my favorite read of the entire year. I'll link the video where I talk about my best books of 2024 down below. So that makes me even more excited to get to Still Life by Sarah Winman. And don't know if I will read it in print. Don't know if I would listen to the audio. I started the audio of Tin Man and then switched to print. So it's going to be interesting seeing what I would like to do when I get around to it. But I'm even more excited to get to Still Life. No danger of this going anywhere because Sarah Winman is an author that I would really like to explore more. And then we have Fiona and Jane by Jean Chen Ho. This goes back to the days when I was a member of Book of the Month Club. You might notice the Book of the Month logo was on Still Life by Sarah Winman. So I sometimes would feel like, I have a credit, I could get a book at a discount, and I would just end up getting books. And part of the reason I unsubscribed from Book of the Month is that it felt like that was a source for a lot of books that I would bring into my library and then ultimately find that I wasn't interested in reading. And that is what happened with Fiona and Jane. So I unhauled it and I haven't read it. Part of that is also because, I feel like this is a situation where in the real world, outside of Book of the Month Club, I would have had it on my list of books to get, and then I would have heard feedback from people who had read it, and it would have let me know, all right, that feels like a book that I can let slide. But because I was a member of Book of the Month Club at the time, I got it and then heard feedback from people, and it just started thinking, oh, well, I can let that one go. But it was here, so it's unhauled. And that is why I'm no longer a member of Book of the Month. For a lot of people, it works. For me, I just started to realize when I was doing book haul revisits that Book of the Month Club was a huge source for books that I unhauled without reading. So for me, it wasn't necessarily working. So of those 4 books that I brought into my library in January of 2022, I have only read 1, which is 25%. Again, even I can do that math. And that was The Membranes by Chi-Ta Wei, translated by Ari Larissa Heinrich. I have unhauled 2 of the books for a 50% result. One of those was The Membranes, which I had read, and one of those was Fiona and Jane, which means I have one book that I unhauled without reading, and that is a 25% result as well. There are no books that I listened to on audio because, again, I only read one, and I read that one in print. So that is where we are with that. Let's go back to January of 2021. The usual MO for my book hauls is that the further back you go, the larger the book haul gets. Because in my early days on BookTube, I was a little more, well, also a lot of the things that I purchased in later years, to be fair, were for my Pulitzer Project and things like that. Like, I bought a lot of Louise Erdrich books, but I don't count them because I wanted to own every single one of her books. So part of it is that in my early days of being on BookTube, I was really excited and wanted to purchase all of the things so I could talk about them on my channel. And I don't do that anymore, or I hope I don't do that anymore. And part of it is that I pivoted to thinking more intentionally. Like, if I'm going to spend a lot of money on something, I want it to be something that means something. And I've just been a little bit more careful. Also, money has gotten tighter since the days when I was the early days when I was on BookTube. So anyway, that's all just an intro to a much larger book haul revisit for January of 2021. The first one is actually a success story. I feel like I knocked Book of the Month Club pretty hard. And here's a success story. The Prophets by Robert Jones Jr. I got this from Book of the Month because I hadn't even heard of it until it was listed with the options for Book of the Month Club. And it immediately sounded like something that I wanted to read. I jumped on it. I read it. I loved it. I thought this was an absolutely fantastic book. And I was disappointed not to see it pop up on more awards lists as 2021 went on, and it didn't even show up in a lot of best of lists as the year went on. And it felt like it kind of faded away. I do feel like people still find out about it and find their way to this book, which makes me very happy because it's a great book. And I would say definitely an underrated book as well. So here is a success story for Book of the Month Club, since I feel like I knocked it pretty hard. Well, talked about how it didn't work for me, but that was a success story for sure. Then there was My Friend Dahmer by Derf Backderf. That is a graphic memoir. I did read it, and I found it very interesting. It's a graphic memoir about how Derf Backderf had gone to high school with Jeffrey Dahmer, and it's about that experience. Very interesting book. I went through a period where I didn't have a lot of room where I keep my graphic novels back here, and I ultimately decided, I'm not really likely to reread that book, so I'm going to take it to my local used bookstore and put it out there for someone else to pick up and enjoy. So that is ultimately what I did. But I did read it, and I did enjoy it. I would recommend it to you if you're interested in that kind of thing. I can only really do true crime if it is interrogating the subject in an interesting way and not sensationalizing it. And My Friend Dahmer really interrogates the question of how Jeffrey Dahmer was allowed to slip through the cracks when, even in high school, there were noticeable problems that nobody noticed or helped him with. And it scratched that itch that if I want to read a true crime, I needed to do something like that, and it definitely did. The next book is Born to be Posthumous: The Eccentric Life and Mysterious Genius of Edward Gorey by Mark Derry. Basically, in January of 2021, someone had given me a gift card for Christmas, and I had been trying to get a copy of this book for a long time, and I wanted it on audio. There was no audio available. There is an audio now, and my local library didn't have a copy. So finally I just said, all right, I have this gift card. I'm going to buy this book. And now there are other avenues that I could use to get the book, but that's fine. I am a fan of Edward Gorey's art. If you probably know his art, even if you don't think you know who he is, there are not really photos or examples. There are photos in this book, but I haven't seen a single example of his illustrations that I could show you. So it is what it is. I haven't read it, but to me, this is definitely something that I would like to get to someday. I'm more likely to do it on audio. That's just the way it is. But I'm happy having it in my library because I am an Edward Gorey fan, and I think it will be interesting. And it does have photos and footnotes in it. So that will be a good way. It'll be good to have a copy of the book, I think. Then we have A Boy's Own Story by Edmund White. I also purchased this with a gift card after the holidays. And if you follow along, you're probably laughing because you might know I still have not read an Edmund White book, and I really need to fix that. And part of why I haven't done it is I want to start with A Boy's Own Story. This is pretty much a perennial feature on my Pride Month pile of possibilities, and I just haven't gotten around to it. But I will, and even if I don't, I'm fine having it here because this is a queer classic, and I am fine having it in my library for that reason. But hopefully I will read it sometime soon. Then, another book I got with that gift card, Cantoras by Carolina de Robertis. I have heard so many good things about this book, and I still haven't read it. This is another perennial fixture on my Pride Month pile of possibilities, and I still haven't read it. So hopefully this will be the year, but I think I said the same thing in January of 2024. Let's see if it actually happens this year. In the meantime, like I said, a lot of people have given me great feedback about this book, so I'm happy to hold on to it. Then there is a book called A Matter of Life and Sex by Oscar Moore. There is a naked behind on this cover. I don't care, but just in case that's something that would offend you, I'm going to cover it up. This is something that I had heard about on Sean Breathes Books channel, so I looked online and found a used copy of the book. And I haven't read it. I didn't really have any intentions to get to it anytime soon. And, here we are 3 years later, and I haven't. So I'm not entirely surprised that I haven't. This, to me, was a bit of a library builder. Something I got so I would have it in my library. I kind of love the idea of having queer classics mixed into my library, so I love having it here. Someday I will get around to reading it. I almost held it up without blocking. But someday I will get around to reading it, and in the meantime, I'm fine having it. This was the same case. Sean Breathes Books talked about Safe as Houses by Alex Jeffers, and I found a used copy online and really just wanted to have some nice queer classics or forgotten queer classics or potentially forgotten queer classics in my library. So I don't really feel bad that I haven't gotten around to it yet, but someday I would really like to. So it will be here in the meantime. Then we actually have another book of the month fail. The Removed by Brandon Hobson. I got it and ultimately decided I don't really feel like this is something I'm ever going to get around to reading, so I released it back into the wild, but I did not read it. So of the 8 books that I brought into my library in January of 2021, I have read 2. Doing the math on Google assures me that that is a 25% success rate. I have unhauled 2 books as well, also 25%. One of those books was unhauled without having been read, so that's 1 out of 8, and that, according to Google, is a 12.5%. I don't want to call it a fail rate, maybe like a course correction rate, something for me to think about. And I didn't listen to either of the books that I read on audio, so that's a 0. Let's move back to January of 2020, the largest month in this book haul revisit. The first book that I brought into my library in January of 2020 was this pocket edition of A Single Man by Christopher Isherwood. It's a Picador Modern Classics. They come in this tiny little size that could fit in your pocket. I just thought it was kind of cute. It was something that I wanted to read, so I grabbed it. Ultimately, I did listen to this book on audio. There is a beautiful audio with a great narrator, but again, I don't really feel bad because this is a book that I wanted to have in my library. I had read the Berlin stories by Christopher Isherwood before, so it felt safe that I would like this one. So, and again, it's a queer classic. So yes, I listened to it on audio. Yes, I am going to keep track of that going forward, but I don't feel like that's a failure, and I don't feel bad about having spent the money on this book to bring it into my library. So that's how we started January of 2020. At that time, I was also obsessed with these vintage Japan books that had been released in the the UK, and I ordered a couple of them, and I think most of them actually came in February. So stay tuned for my February book haul revisit for more of these. This is Out by Natsuo Kurino. They don't say the name of the translator on the cover. It's translated from the Japanese by Stephen Snyder. I have not read this. I have heard very mixed things about this book since I ordered it. And since it has been in my library, I feel like someday I would like to try this book to read it for myself and see what I think. If I keep hearing negative things about it, I might reconsider that stance. But for now, I'm totally fine leaving this in my library and seeing if and when I ultimately get around. Because another thing, I want to try to have a bit of a global library and global authors to choose from if I'm looking for something to read off of my shelves. So this kind of fits in that mold as well. So there's a chance I might end up never reading this. I might end up unhauling it because, again, I've heard some pretty negative things about it, but I've heard a couple of positive things as well. So we will see what ultimately happens with Out by Natsuo Kirino. Then there was The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. I did read that book. I did it as a buddy read, and I think N.K. Jemisin is a great writer. I have this knee-jerk thing, and I can't quite explain it. I don't like things that just end on a cliffhanger, and I don't like when there's a series and you are intended to immediately go to the next book. I don't like that. If I'm going to read a series, I like to take breaks. And The Fifth Season is largely set up. It's world building. Like, there is plot stuff in it, but you are really, it's like over 500 pages. It's a thick book. If it's not over 500 pages, it's a thick book. And it feels like it's setting up story for the second volume. It's a trilogy. So it's setting up stories for the next one, and then it ends on a cliffhanger, and I was annoyed by that. So I got rid of it, and maybe someday I would consider revisiting the series and finishing it. I think N.K. Jemisin is a great writer. I see why so many people like her and her writing as much as they do. I don't do a lot of sci-fi and fantasy, so I feel like I see why. I think that might be enough for me. I see what people respond to, and I don't need to continue, if that makes sense. Then there was Such a Long Journey by Rohinton Mystery. This I had purchased because in January of 2020, I had been planning a buddy read of this book with Sean Breed's books and someone else. And then in January of 2020, or in early February, when we were supposed to be beginning that buddy read, I ended up having surgery to repair an umbilical hernia. So I had to bow out of the buddy read. And then I think the other person, who I can't remember, also ended up bowing out of the buddy read as well. So none of us ended up reading this book. I really loved A Fine Balance by Rohinton Mystery. So I feel like I'm fine holding on to this. I don't have the immediate urge to read it. Like, I had plans to read it at the time I purchased it. And someday I would still like to get to it because I loved A Fine Balance. That was one of my favorite books the year in which I read it, which was probably 2019, and probably what led to the buddy read idea for Such a Long Journey in 2020. And it just didn't happen. And I have thought about, like, do I want to get to this? And then every time I pick it up and look at it, I think, yeah, I do. I want to read another book by Rohinton Mystery. So someday I will hopefully get around to reading this book, but I have not yet. Then there was Cloud Street by Tim Winton. I did ultimately read that book. I did it as a buddy read. I don't really do buddy reads anymore, but in 2020, I did a bunch of them. I did not get on with Cloud Street very well. I could be convinced to read a different Tim Winton book at some point, but I feel like it left a bad enough taste in my mouth that I feel like I don't want to, ruin everybody's party. If you are a Tim Winton fan, that's fine. I see what people like about his writing. I just didn't quite get along with it myself. And for that reason, I think pretty much as soon as I finished it, I traded it in at my local used bookstore. Then I went on a Sarah Waters party. I got 3 of those books. I read one and ultimately decided I didn't feel like I needed to keep it, so I only have the 2 that I have not read anymore. The 2 that I still have are Affinity and Tipping the Velvet. I would like to get around to them at some point. The one that I read was Fingersmith, and actually I ended up listening to that one on audio. I had listened to, I think, The Paying Guests by Sarah Waters on audio. It feels like audio is kind of the way to go for Sarah Waters because there are really great productions of her books. So ultimately, if I do read Affinity and Tipping the Velvet, that is probably the route that I'm going to take. And hopefully I will have a better experience than Fingersmith. I just thought that was too complicated of a book. So we'll see what ends up happening with these books, but I'm totally fine having them on my shelves for now and seeing if and when I ultimately get around to them. It's if I do, it's likely that it would be on audio. And that's okay with me because she is a good writer. And, again, I love having good queer books in my library. The final book is, where we also kind of, it's proof that Book of the Month Club wasn't necessarily for me. So I think that month, that is the only January 2020 book that would have been a Book of the Month book. Tightrope by Nicholas D. Kristof and Cheryl Wu Dunn. So a lot of the time when I was a member, there would be a list of books that I just wasn't interested in. And I would feel like I should use the credit. So I ended up doing that. And that was definitely the case here. So the more I had Tightrope on my shelf, the more I was like, I don't think I'm ever going to read that book. So I released it into the wild. And a lot of the time, there would also be, so they would have their main picks for Book of the Month, if you're not familiar with how it works. And then there would be other books that you could get, but you can't get any of them if you don't pick one of their main picks for the month. So I'm trying to quickly scroll through and see if there's an example of that. I think that might be what happened because The Prophets by Robert Jones Jr. and The Removed by Brandon Hobson were both Book of the Month books that I got in the same month. And I may have gotten The Removed so I could get The Prophets, but I can't remember which one was the main pick. Or if both of them were. But anyway, so long story short, I did not read Tightrope and I unhauled it. Of those 9 books, I have actually read 4. That's kind of the good news about the older book hauls as well. Usually they have sat in my library long enough that I'm more likely to have read them. So 4 out of 9, pretty good. My goal, and again, I use the term goal loosely because it's not something strict that I want to adhere to. But my line of thinking is that if I'm about 50%, I'm doing okay. 4 out of 9 is 44%. So I'm almost there with this. I've unhauled 4. Again, that's 44%. I only unhauled 1 without reading, and that was Tightrope. So that's 11% of that book haul. And I listened to 2 out of the 9 books on audio for 22% of that book haul ultimately. But, to me, that's more of a point of interest. It's not something I want to hold myself accountable to. Overall, looking back at the last 5 January book hauls of mine, I brought 27 books into my library. That number feels pretty consistent in other months that I have done over the last year. It'll be interesting to see where we land, but 27 feels pretty consistent based on how my other book haul revisits over the last few months have gone. I've read 9 of those books. That's 33%. And again, I'd like to be at about halfway. So there's a little bit of work to be done. However, there are a lot of books in this group that I would still really like to get to. I'm still ashamed that I haven't read A Boy's Own Story and Cantora's in particular at this point. So hopefully that number will continue to climb as time moves on. I have unhauled 8 of those books, which is 28% of my overall book hauls. And I unhauled 3 books without reading. So 3 out of 27, not bad. That's 11%, according to Google. And my guiding metric for that, and again, it's not a strict limit, is that I'd like that number to be 15% or less. So 11% is pretty good. I'm feeling not bad about that. I listened to 3 of the 27 books on audio instead of reading the physical book that I had brought into my library, which is also, again, 11%. And, it's a number that I'm going to keep track of, but just to, say it one last time for the people in the back, it's not something I necessarily feel bad about. But I do think it is an interesting metric to watch over time because it could be interesting. So that's how I have done in my January book haul revisit. If you have thoughts about any of the books, please let me know in the comment section down below. If you have recommendations for where I should start reading these books, let me know in the comment section down below. I'll be back with a book haul for the month of January. Very excited to talk about the books that I brought into my library for 2025 that we will be talking about in a year's time. Hopefully, with a lot of them having been read, but we'll see. So stay tuned for that. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.